Welcome and thank you for joining us for the second webinar in the Living Dialogs series. And my name is Edgar Cardenas, and I'm the Associate Director for the Toolbox Dialogue Center at Michigan State University and a collaborator with Living Architecture Systems Group. I'm also the co-producer of the Living Dialogs series. The second webinar episode of the series is about biology, computation, and care in the Anthropocene. It started with the release of the episode 2 podcast on August 27th and continued in episode 3 on October 21st. You can find those podcasts on Spotify, Google Podcast, and at podcast.lesg.ca. This webinar will continue that discussion in a different format, allowing our guests to go deeper into the topic and respond to some of the thoughts podcast listeners provided on the Living Dialogs website. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Bonnemaison, our moderator, to introduce herself and our guests. Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Mette and Rachel, to come. It's going to be really fun. It's like seeing you again, which is great. And for those people who don't know me, I've been working with the group LAS for now practically 20 years with Philip. And my role in it is to help to develop the theoretical understanding of lightweight structures and of living architecture and all this wonderful world of responsive environments. So I've been practicing in that for quite a while, but also I've been very interested in more historical versions of understanding nature, namely organicism. And a few years ago, I went around and interviewed different people in the group to understand what were their position on it and so on. So some of my questions will relate to this again, maybe from more historians, architectural historians' point of view. But to begin, I wanted to ask if both Mette and Rachel could do just a quick 5-minute presentation of your work so that the audience could see more what is your work about, because of course you heard what the ideas are, but I think it will be very helpful to have some images. So whoever wants to start, maybe Mette?
Thank you so much. I put a few slides together and I thought it might just be interesting to both set a stage and talk a little bit about how to build new understandings inside of a sort of emergent field that we're working with. Of course, I think it's nearly impossible to operate as an architect right now without reconsidering practice and understanding ourselves as being inside of a limited, I wouldn't say limited planet, but inside a new understanding or emerging understanding of the planet as being a closed loop space of resource, and that this idea of endless growth, the practices of use and throwing away, they are ended. There is no more throw away. There is no away, and instead that we need to operate within the planetary boundaries. I think that this sort of a fundamental understanding is on the backbone of all of us. In our work, this has led to an increasingly strong curiosity of what it would mean to move away from a dependence on the geosphere of non-renewables, of extracting materials, into more participatory models of being part of cycles of material regeneration. A fundamental insight here lies with the foundation of circularity of biomass. So Needham in 59 talks about biomass being a closed loop, steady state system with a cycle of a few thousand years. I think this is super inspiring because a few thousand years, if we look out the window, we can see architecture. You can see the pyramids that starts engaging with these kind of time zones, timescapes, and I think that is really interesting that the artifacts that we build and by the materials by which we build them might start new cycles of resonance in which one is designed for the other. But the way we understand materials, the way we understand buildings, as no longer sort of parapet of failure, but rather one of a rhythmic intersection. And it takes us from a very fundamental value proposition within architecture that is aligned with permanence and firmitas to a very different architectural ideal, which is maybe more furry and hairy, perhaps made out of materials that have natural cycles of being continuously replaced, and maybe also the building as having embedding different temporalities, that not everything is designed to the same end goal. So when we start talking about that, I think what is so important about this is really to consider, well, what is the future that we're educating for, but also how, by which means can we design for these kinds of material paradigms? What new skills do we need? What is the role of intuition? What is the role of the embedded knowledge by which we start engaging with materials? And what is the evolving role of the architect if we just went through an era of the digital, in which we became machinists, simulationists, and so on? How do we now start engaging with new questions of how biology and technology can intersect, challenging our material practices and allowing us to reconsider how materials can be generated, how they can be grown, and what our role as designers of these kind of systems are. It allows us to reconsider what representation is, and I think that maybe these last 15, 20, 25 years of working within the digital, was it just really a dry run, allowing us to build the methodological foundations for other ways of thinking about the interactions between the way materials are thought and the way they perform, so we can start thinking about how we can engage with a living substrate. And of course, what's our own role within it? How do we interact with, what does it mean to live inside of a living building? How do we consider a social program in that way? So in our new project, the eco-metabolistic model, funded by the ERC, we're looking at 3 different material perspectives, all tied to a bio-based materiality. And these go from a sort of 10,000 year tradition of timber construction to a sort of 20th century tradition of the designed material, which we have seen excel in fossil fuel-based polymers, but which have equal precursors in the bio-based polymers, and then finally also with living organisms here, 3D printed hydrogels for as bacterial hosts. And what we're looking at here is really to consider how new intersections between data, what kind of data can we harvest, and how do we correlate it. Here we're looking at CT scan data from timber industry and how this can be orchestrated in new material maps, allowing us to reconsider where materials are placed. Or here in the biopolymer project, we're wondering how to characterize behavior and mold in bio-based materials, creating new sort of data gathering principles to be able to construct new temporal based representations, or finally here in Imprimer la Lumière, which are working with these bioluminescent bacteria, really considering how we can be designers of substrates, and by articulating substrates both topologically but also sort of recipe-wise, by understanding that by designing the substrates on which bacteria or parallel organisms live, then we can start considering how this, or we can start steering the interaction between organisms and ourselves. So I wanted to make a micro pitch at the end. If we go back to sort of meta discourse, we could say, well, what is all of this for? And of course, in a decade of action, it's incredibly important that we engage architectural practice with questions of sustainability. And here I've been lucky to be appointed together with Martin Tamke as the general reporter, head of the scientific track of the World Congress in 2023, in which we are trying to ask how can architecture contribute to the resolving of the achieving of the SDGs. And here we're looking very, very broadly across all the different parameters that architecture works across, and trying to find out how to untie the silos of knowledge within our own discipline, within architecture, and create new discussions of agency and correlation between this relationship between the planetary boundaries and the need for a sort of social equality. So yeah, well, there will be a call coming out in the spring, and we hope very much that you will contribute.
That's wonderful, Mette. And where is that going to take place?
In Copenhagen, but hybrid. So it will be a World Congress. It's a UIA. It's a very, very large organization. It collected 20,000 people in Seoul in 2017. And what we are designing is something like 8,000 to 12,000 people, but also across hybrid platforms. So allowing us to mitigate travel as well.
That's great. Thank you so much for putting together this slideshow and to tell us about this. And hopefully, we'll be able to participate one way or another. So Rachel, would you like to take over just for a few minutes also to do a presentation?
Well, it's absolutely amazing to see Mette's work up to date. I'm going to start with a short video. It's short, so don't panic. So since I was a kid, I've wanted to build life. I used to muck around with jam jars and creatures in my backyard. My mum always used to make sure that I didn't have my best clothes on when I was out there, because I'd go out with a spoon and a hunting jar, and I'd try to figure out how to make systems more lively. And so my work's really coming from a life sciences perspective, as it were. I trained as a medical doctor before I fell into the wonderful and magical field of architectural design. And I have really wanted to apply living principles to the production entities and spaces. And I think particularly I'm really interested in this idea of what is it that makes something living so unique. And the first work that I was doing was looking for a pared down model of a living self-assembling system, and I thought it would be more simple even than genetics. I had a bit of a political issue with genetics and the explanations for how we became who we were, with notions of determinism, which took away things like free will and consigned people to certain kinds of fate. And so I thought there must be a material or technical alternative than the gene. And so I found a model called the protocell, which was being investigated by Martin Hanzak and Takashi Ikegami, and started to work with that in a context really to strip down notions of metabolism to its bare essentials. So essentially working with water and alkali to generate forms of soap. And then thinking about how this system then can be applied in different contexts. And because I was working in Venice at the time, I started to think about how this might actually create a bottom-up assembled structure, working with the foundations of the city, and finding ways to direct these entities so that they could produce more substantial masses. And really exploring all the potentials for those intersections and metabolic relations. So this was Future Venice 2 here, which was looking at the way that algae and plastics might be able to interrelate to form new island masses for the city. And then I worked back into metabolisms, which could be more sustained and complex using microbial systems. And I was the coordinator for the Living Architecture project, an EU-funded project from 2016 to 2019, which is really a city for organisms, looking at diverse communities and how the different economic exchanges going on in these tiny microbial worlds can create a resource circular system and, as it were, a living economy, going back to notions of the Greek household and its fundamental circularity, but not lack of openness. And recently we've exhibited this autonomous entity, you could call it a life form, or, but it's kind of part cyborg, part microbial. So this Alice project has a set of stomachs that process waste, turn that into forms of energy and communication. And this is a collaboration with Julie Freeman and Yanis Iropoulos from the University of the West of England. And essentially Alice is, as I said, a kind of creature, but it also has this online brain that we can go and explore online at the website, allowing you to have a look at the data coming out of the microbes, because they produce electricity. So the electricity is both a form of energy and it's a form of data. So we're working quite literally with these information and energy flows from microbes. Again, that thing of, so what is it that actually constitutes a life? Are these kind of hybrid systems that flow from machine to microbe and through our bodies? Are we kinds of holobionts? How do we actually start to design with extended and expanded ecosystems? And this was another rendering of this into a kind of more architectural scale work as a collaboration with Cecile B. Evans and the University of West of England, where this putative future space powered by microbes, not needing humans in order for a functional life, is there really conjuring forth electronic ghosts from our past, present, and future. So essentially, yes, that's giving you a very brief overview of what I've been up to, really thinking about the flow of electrons as maybe the kind of an essentialist view of metabolism and its continual exchange being a platform for making constructed life forms.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel, for putting that together. I think it will be very helpful for our conversation. So I have a question from Brian. But before we start, if you don't mind, I would like to ask both of you a little bit to reflect, because in both of your presentation, you're drawing from a historical reference. So for Mette, you were looking at Nedman in 1963, the idea of the closed loop. And then you just mentioned, Rachel, the Greek household and the idea of the eco house, right? And then so I was just as a historian, I'm just curious. I have no idea what you're going to say, but I would be interested to see how you go back in history to draw some energy for your work. Because personally, I'll just say as a parenthesis, I was trained in an era that was all about criticism and about being critical and about killing the father. And you had to come up with your own new idea, right? And so I've been personally trying to look more at ways to look back in history at people that actually would be helpful, or notions that would be helpful. And so that's why I was interested to see that both of you did this just briefly. And if you could just tell me what is, I don't know, whatever you want to say about what I'm saying. So Mette, is your big reference for you where you're drawing energies, this idea of closed loop? Is that something really important for your work?
I think what I'm finding really inspiring right now is the sort of change in the sustainability discourse. I think it's not only even the cybernetic sort of understanding that underlies that, but also sort of broader link between the 70s environmentalism and sort of emerging ecosophic traditions. So I think this idea of the techno-social network and the focus on that, especially in the fields of computational design, I think living architecture creates really interesting sort of sticks in the wheel for it, because, or sustainability discourse does, no? Because if digital design could be said to be predicated on an idea that you could somehow formalize all the properties of materials and then understand them and then either simulate or predict their behavior, then I think that what we're learning through sustainability discourse is that some of the key foundations of how we're working maybe doesn't work anymore. So what happens to questions like sort of a humanist universalism, albeit, you know, very modernist, no, but albeit very in the best intentions, then what happens to that when we start thinking about multi-species living and ideas of that we might be using living organisms as material, or if we look to questions of, I think that Arne who's a sort of eco-philosopher from the 70s, Norwegian philosopher, he talks about shallow and deep ecosophy. And I think what's interesting there is really that neither are right or neither are wrong. It's not like deep is good and shallow is bad. It's more that we need to address sustainability from multiple levels. And so, yes, we need to instrumentalize and find new solutions, but also we need to reconsider our practices and our sort of epistemological standing. And I think that sort of double movement is really, really interesting. Around us, we see, I mean, I don't think it's really fair to call everything greenwashing, but we do see a lot of things that are green for many, many different reasons. And I think that a lot of this has to do that we have taken both methodologies and simply shifted the optimum. So if optimum used to be, let's optimize, let's make it, or let's make it structurally optimal, or let's use less materials, or let's, what is the optimum? Then now it maybe becomes embedded energy or CO2 calculations. So we just simply take the same method, we just replace the optimum. I think that the sustainability discourse allows us to reconsider that much deeper. And so it's not like stopping one practice to jump into a big hole where we don't know how to act, but it's more like, how do we act across these different divides, and how do we allow ourselves a fundamental questioning of what it means to practice as we enter a new set of goals.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's more like an evolution of a model as opposed to replacing a model, which was more what we were taught to do.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, but maybe.
Rachel, would you like to talk about the Greek ethos?
Yeah, although we've been looking into the nature of life for, millennia, we still don't have an agreed definition. And so I guess my starting point is actually, if I start with a quote from Bruno Latour, that the aim is to start again from the bottom up, the description of dwelling places, in the sense that where we live or how we live should be life promoting and not otherwise. So if we don't know what life is, that provides, it means that we can interpret it in many sterile ways, as it were, which is why I'm kind of really focused on this idea of, what is the life force? How do we conjure that, channel it, kind of draw it into our world? How do we keep that close to us, and how do we share that? And so the Greek household was extremely interesting in the notion that Hannah Arendt raised, which is the basis of Zoe, the bare life force, let's say the necessary conditions for existence, which was performed by the household. So in order for the man in democracy to be able to have an active political life, that all his needs needed to be catered for within the household, which were performed by all kinds of, family or kind of other forms of entities, from a little plot of land to pigs to slaves to children. And there's a kind of centricity on that, kind of acknowledging that there's a necessary condition for our existence, from which then kind of more, let's say, I was going to say cultural or maybe kind of political activities can exist. And so Arendt was saying, that when we deny people this political existence, they just get trapped into these never-ending circles of kind of, bare life without any kind of quality or contribution to society, which is, alienating and ultimately dehumanizing. So this was a starting point, in the sense that we've made a lot of assumptions about what an economy is, for example, and what is important about how we live. We seem to have markets being this great, solution for our advancement. And yet, if we go back to the ecos, the market is, if we look at Aristotle and Plato, they look down on external forms of trade, and that actually it was a great thing to be able to manage one's household very well. And if we also look at the origins of the word metabolism and animal economy, these ideas of self sustenance, what is the minimal requirements for living together, for this kind of personal responsibility, getting to a point of a generosity, where we go beyond, the lowest levels of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it's really kind of starting with that fundamental question in the 21st century. What is it that we need to live? And when we live, how do we actually draw life into our world so that it can be enhanced and not depleted? Because that is not the model that we have right now.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that sounds totally correct. I mean, I would agree with you. So now, actually, we have a question from Brian, and it was aimed for you, Rachel, but I would love if both people, both you and Mette, could maybe think about it. So his question is that, is there a point where biological processes can be understood to have an alchemist transformative quality? Do you want me to say it again? No?
I got it. Oh, yeah. I mean, the term metabolism comes out of alchemy, which was about transmutation. And this idea that a body could change with time was a great paradox for the Enlightenment. It's, you know, by thinking of matter in its classical form, creates this paradox of how change in matter happens, because the Newtonian instruments, the classical instruments that we have, are not, it's not easy to figure it out. And what happened in the 20th century is that we managed to get away from the idea of these kind of brute molecules that were then vitalized, controversially or not, or were just more complex forms of chemistry, and simply by adding different layers. So cybernetics comes along as a very interesting way of escaping that existential question is, well, how does matter change? And yet, you know, so in the 21st century, we're drawing these notions of quantum biology into our discourses. So since the 1980s, you know, the non-classical aspects of the living world are starting to permeate our thinking. So in some ways, alchemy has never really left the issue of biology, if we can also just look at the root of biology, which separates from Zoe, being a particular quality of life. And if we also look at the limits of biology, which have difficulty with things like viruses, which weren't really recognized as material entities until the 1930s, although historically they've been recognized as kind of miasmas and these kinds of, you know, bad spirits. So absolutely, there's still, it's not to mystify life. It's simply to say that we still cannot really configure our concepts in a way that allows us to you know, kind of fully channel you know, incredible materiality and kind of transactions that go on in the living world. And alchemy is absolutely at the heart of that, I think, because it relates to ancient forms of knowledge. I think there's been a physical and a practical knowledge with life throughout the ages, and the Enlightenment has kind of partitioned some of that off. The stuff it can name, it's been able to work with. The stuff it can't name, it's had much more difficulties with.
Yeah, and it also refuses the idea that there's memory embedded in materials, which is another thing that I would love to talk about. Maybe after Mette, do you want to talk about alchemy?
I don't think I'm suited to talk about alchemy, but I love
That's
what
okay.
you're saying, Rachel. I think it is this idea that the knowledge spaces that we're working with, maybe modernism presented us with sort of, or enlightenment presented us with traditions which seem to be able to present a whole, that we are searching now for other kinds of knowledges. I think in architecture, a lot of that, what you were also talking about in the start there, you know, is this idea of what you were saying, you know, Rachel, the idea of mucking around and having your hands dirty as a kid. Now, I think there is a sort of quite fundamental understanding in architecture that a lot happens through the hand, no? So knowing through the eye and through the hand, or through the mind and the hand, and getting them connected, you know, has been the remit also back to Bauhaus and so on. So I think it's about teasing out new intuitions and allowing ourselves to understand from anew. And new theoretical frameworks push us to do that. So we had an interesting discussion in our school. So many people here interested in timber construction. And so we teach timber all over the school, timber construction, timber ideas, forestry, circularity, so on. And so somebody asked provocatively, could we not just have one timber course? Do we really need 15 different timber courses across the school? And of course, it's this plurality that, it would be dreadful if we thought that it could be taught with one voice. No? Although there's a lot of overlap, and of course, in many ways, might also even be teaching to the same vector, then this multiplicity and breadth of repeating, saying it's just slightly different, and learning the tools just slightly different is really about building up practice and building up quite singular understandings of what it means to work with a material. I think that biodesign, in all its breadth, is also allowing us to do so. And that was, I was saying in the introduction also, is that timber construction is one of the oldest constructions. We have constructions that date back to 10,000 years. So it is hardly new. But it doesn't mean that it cannot be new all the time. No? So there's something about this rediscovery that I think is essential.
Exactly. Which brings me to this issue of the embedded memory in material. And if either of you think that this is something that is important and should be taken into consideration when trying to do something new, to also obviously work with the memory within the material itself that has been carried for such a long time, and that we're touching again, whether it's like stones or wood and so on. Rachel, do you would like to just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think an awareness of the paradigms of space. I think although I definitely work with the material because that's what I can manipulate. So that even when I think about things about like memory, I'm thinking materially about them. But that is not to say that all those materials are classical. And I think that materials do not exist without context. And so I think that our thinking is really starting to be contextualized in ways where previously we possibly abstract things in order to conform with the modern paradigm, and to complicate materiality by its situatedness, its relationships with other things, beings, but also, let's say, Latour's notion of the geo-story, where these entities have also come from. And in that sense, there is need for indigenous knowledges. And I think that Anna Singh's and her colleagues' book, Arts for Living on a Damaged Planet, really beautifully expands kind of thinking in this field through the idea of monsters and ghosts. And kind of monsters with the kind of the impossible creativity, the material creativity of the living world, and the ghosts being this other kind of haunting of spaces by things that we cannot draw down easily with the tools and practices that we have right now, but to actually kind of acknowledge the space of our unknowingness and make room for it, so that notion of doubt, uncertainty, and the unexpected is actually present in the things that we do. So for me, this perhaps this idea of memory is kind of an expanded space of uncertainty, of context, of notions of time and relation that traditionally, or let's say, from an Enlightenment modern perspective, is something that we have kind of rarefied, so that we have greater control over these things.
Yeah, so not to be afraid of what we've forgotten and what has been forgotten. absolutely.
There's a certain humility with it,
Yeah.
I think, and a kind of attentiveness to the stuff that isn't about us. You know, even if our impulses are to make it all about us, I think that pause that creates the space of possibility between what we think should happen and what is possible, I think is really important to be opening up.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, as a historian, I experience this when I'm in the archives, where I see things and there's big holes, and my imagination falls right in those holes and rebuilds a history that probably has never existed. But that's my creative part, you know. And
we learn a lot from that space. Yeah,
I do think so too. Absolutely. Okay, so we have a question from James, and I don't know if everybody can see it, but so I'll read it out. So you've spoken to this a bit already, but could you speak further about your work's implication for consciousness and human agency? For instance, Jen Bennett speaks about wrestling with entries into the and exits from our bodies by outside agents. How do you understand your work with living systems? Is there an epistemology we can construct there with a built environment? So maybe I'll hand it over to Mette first, just to be fair. And then
I think it's a very Rachel-oriented question.
Okay.
I'm sure what Rachel will say.
Okay, so whoever wants to speak.
I'm very happy to speak because I feel very comfortable with this question, because one of the moves that I've been trying to make is kind of going back to the, so if we go to the idea of what is it that flows through us, and there's a wonderful chemist who's written a book called World from Dust, called Ben McFarlane, and he says that when it boils down to it, life is the continual flow of electrons. Right, so that's an oversimplification, right? Because obviously there are atoms, and atoms have these kinds of masses and characteristics. And you know, when we get to organic atoms, they're folded and they're complex, and you know, computers have a hard time trying to predict what they're going to do. So, but if we take the idea of life as the continual flow of electrons between different bodies, or between bodies or between atoms, but it's continual, then we actually start to think about a platform that helps us read what life could be. And obviously, you know, back at the turn of the 19th century, we have Galvani, who was doing the frog's legs dissections, and the work coming from that inspired Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And then we had Volta, who was a big critic of Galvani, who went, yeah, but I don't think it's the frog, I think it's the electrodes. So he went away and made the chemical battery. And with the chemical battery, he could produce huge amounts of power, which gave rise to the Industrial Revolution. That's a gross simplification. But what I'm interested in is this idea of the bioelectricity. Why is it that nature doesn't produce 230 volts on tap in the planet? What is it that we miss out by using huge amounts of energy when actually we could be using much smaller amounts of energy to connect bodies, as it were? And we can harvest electrons through metabolisms. So if the continual flow of life is the passage of electrons through your tissues and out into the environment through the things that you eat, the things that you excrete, eaten and excreted by other things, and there's this continuous flow, and even the rocks themselves can exchange electrons in all kinds of different redox reactions, which are kind of forms of chemistry. If this is a lovely fabric that's kind of exciting and flowing through things, then the idea which came out of the Enlightenment, which is the separation of the body from the consciousness, is no longer this great chasm that we have to somehow or other resolve, because life, matter, and thought are actually part of this same flow and exchange that happens uniquely as far as we know on this planet. And it may be happening in mineral contexts on other planets, except we haven't seen it yet. So this idea then, for me, the idea of this a kind of a metabolic currency, electron exchanges, kind of picking up data and energy, looking at the materiality that, if you imagine electrons like the objects that a juggler passes, and that the juggler's body is like the atom, and that jugglers can pass electrons between each other. And as they gather more and more electrons, they might change their body shape, or it might drop a few. But essentially what you're seeing is, what we see is the change of atoms in relationship to electrons. And so this idea that material change can happen through these flows that are actually part now of our understanding of physics and chemistry, and we've had trouble trying to articulate their relationship to biology, and I think that that's coming with quantum biology and kind of new narratives emerging. But I really think now that we're getting to a stage where consciousness, materiality, bodies and environments are actually connected through the flow of something. I'm calling it electrons, but that's more like using both like a metaphor, like a machine, but it's also a real thing. So an electron is a real thing, but I'm also using it as this metaphor for some kind of flow between bodies. So with the work that I'm doing on living systems, I'm looking for these metabolic exchanges, and even if they are intermittent, kind of distributed, kind of highly unusual, I'm looking for how those connections can be made and sustained and replenished by the decisions that we make in space and time, and culture. So essentially, the epistemological connection there really is thinking about these things as being entangled. And I think that there is a material basis for this, but it's not the classical explanations that we've been looking for in the last 350 years or so.
And that reminds me quite a bit about Teilhard de Chardin, because Teilhard de Chardin had imagined this network all around the planet where everything was communicating with everything. And it nearly like the spirit of the planet, isn't it? And then after Teilhard de Chardin wrote, we have the computer. And I think probably the whole digital world is going very much into your direction, Rachel. It's really like emphasizing flow even more.
Well, I think what I would make though is a distinction between industrial scale energy, because if you think of your jugglers, they're trying to juggle these few electrons, and if you bombard them with a million new objects, you're just going to put an end to them. I think what we really need to do is use those few electrons smarter, because that's what biology is doing all the time, and it uses it smarter because of its choice of materials. Different creatures have different kinds of metabolisms. Microbes are the most diverse of all, but they're really inventive about it, and they can literally live anywhere on this planet because of this ability. Whereas we seem to think a solution is by getting more energy and chucking it at something, we can get something cool. Whereas, let's say, for example, a creature might change its metabolism, but do it as a kind of room temperature response, rather than kind of going, if I throw enough energy at this, then I'm going to get my way. So I think we need to be much smarter about this use of natural currency, call it metabolism, call it the electron, and how it isn't just for consumption, but it's capable of change. And we need to think forward into those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So bioelectricity is qualitatively different than industrial electricity, simply because of its force. And we think that force is better. When I would say that nature possibly has some clues about the creativity of using less, and that the constraints that it places on us, which increases the inventiveness of our responses.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Mette, would you like to comment?
It's a hard act to follow, but Rachel, I think it's very, very interesting what you're talking about, and I was not aware of these references. It made me think back to these cybernetic positions that we were talking about in the start, and I thought maybe it would be interesting to talk about that, because of course what cybernetics does is starts to think in networks and correlations rather than in dichotomies, and so it sort of establishes a methodological framework by which we can start understanding how different entities can affect and interact with each other. But I also think that what is emerging is maybe something post-cybernetic, I don't know. But it seems also that maybe there's both an alignment in what you're talking about, because cybernetics is also mathematical formulations, is also a particular way of calculating that allows us to understand this alignment with math means that these networks can be calculated, and by doing so, it also creates a stringency to what it's trying to postulate, which I think is very interesting. Of course, with second order cybernetics, with the human in the loop, then these things become maybe more philosophical than sort of circuitry design systems and so on. But I was wondering, I wonder how we can, how do we represent this, or what is the way of engaging with these kinds of flows? I think when we look to sustainability discourse and also the territories of Latour and Anna Singh, what is emerging is a sense of being able to train a new position, to be able to position ourselves outside of a sort of modernist or anthropocentric or a humanist position. But I think what you were talking about before, Sarah, is also about agency upon that stage. And how do we do that? I find that myself very complicated. Cybernetics has a particular path to how we can be agent, but I am wondering what is the next step within this. How do we act within the network? How do we act across flows, and how do we act between bodies? I think the question is more where we are than the answer.
But I think you're doing it already. You were telling me you're studying animals, right now. You were telling me I think to be humble and to study animals and how they communicate, or nature and so on, is a way to go, instead of trying to figure out what the solution is already.
Yeah, or maybe we need a new position for design. I think design is so interesting. It is has great agency. It is transformative. No? But how do we act as transformative agents? And if we want to be humble, or if we want to be to position ourselves differently, I think. I think maybe quoting my colleague Phil Ayres here in the room, that we maybe need to rethink the importance of control. So when working with living systems, then we also know that they never do what you think they will do. It's so unpredictable. Very, very small differences create huge changes in performance. It feels like holding on to jelly and everything is moving. And so this idea of trying to say, well, from a modernist perception, then I would be able to characterize, and once I characterize, I would be able to control. But maybe this theory is actually exhausted, and what we need to think about are, I'm humble, but maybe, I don't know what the describer is, but other kinds of ways of shaping. And I've been using the word steering for a while, but I think steering is as wrong as controlling, because steering also assumes some sense that, okay, it's not controlling, but it's still, you know, able to somehow shape. And I think there is some other participatory method that we're looking for to replace our idea of what design agency actually is. And yeah, I think we're all looking, you know.
I just want to follow up on that, which is I'm just listening to what you're saying, and kind of remembering about Stafford Beer and the Daphnia experiments. So in the sense that, you know, cybernetics started to get into the biological territory to kind of change the agency of materials, but it was before biology and its kind of molecular biology clothes really existed. And so it was kind of frustrating because you didn't really have the tools to take those experiments further. And the word that you were talking about with steering is I'm wondering whether we're actually talking about limits, because and limits being a good thing. Because if we think about microbial cultures, if we create very particular environments for them, their degrees of freedom for kind of invention are reduced. Doesn't mean that they won't try and find a way around it. But I think that what we can do to negotiate with these kind of disobedient things is to try and understand them a bit better in terms of resource availability, their tendencies, you know, get to know them a bit. But I think this idea of working with limits, I think, might be that kind of creative pressure that maybe sets the conditions of some kind of negotiable diplomacy. And that might be space, it might be material, it might be nutrition, it might be love. But I think it, you know, I think this idea of actually creating that parliament of things, that kind of forum for hammering out what comes next, is absolutely that space that you've just invoked, Mette.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid we have to close, but we're all very inspired by both of you, and I really cherish these times, and I can't thank you enough. And again, for everybody who has listened, please forward this wonderful meeting to your friends, and we can all get our references and reread the books again. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and lovely to be with you, Rachel and Edgar.
You too,
Lovely.
Mette. It's so lovely to catch up.
Yes, more time.